Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon. Welcome. Our guest today is Dr. Lynn Snyder. She is an archaeological and zooarchaeological researcher. She has worked with the Department of Anthropology at the National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and American School of Classical Studies in Athens, Greece, just to name a few. Dr. Snyder is widely published, having written in a myriad of topics, but specializes in dogs, people in social, working, economic, and symbolic interaction, which was the subject of one of her books. She has lectured publicly and presented papers around the globe, including in Mexico City, Puerto Rico, Greece, England, Canada, and throughout the United States. She is a preeminent archaeologist in regards to analyzing animal and dog bones. She is one of the researchers and authors of the Agora Bone Well, which is the topic of discussion today. Welcome, Dr. Snyder.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. It's tradition here to accompany our conversation with a special brew. So our selection today is Single Wide American IPA from Boulevard Brewing Company in Kansas City, Missouri. And I actually had a trip there. Me and my wife had went there, and that's a pretty cool trip. So if you're ever in Kansas City and you're looking for an afternoon, obviously after we get past the COVID, it's a nice little tour, and they got a nice little tap room and stuff like that. I don't know if you like doing those types of things, but it's kind of a cool little trip if you're ever interested in that. So
I will keep it in mind.
Keep it in mind, Dr. Snyder. Remember, you can suggest a future beer. Just subscribe to the History A Go-Go podcast, like our Facebook page, and leave a comment. If your beer is selected, you'll receive a $10 gift card from Hy-Vee. So please subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast and leave a comment or review. So we have a pretty interesting topic today, but I'd like to know how you got your start, because you grew up basically as a farm girl in Western Illinois, Fall Creek.
That's right. Fall Creek Township.
So how does someone from Fall Creek end up basically around the globe, working for the Smithsonian at the Agora Bone Well and all of that? How does that all happen?
It was amazing. I'm still amazed at where I've been and the things that I've been able to do. I started out on a family farm, fourth generation German American, and I had a class in seventh grade, I think, taught by Charlie Hall, Earth Science, that just fascinated me. And I also had, as a dentist, Dan Reed from Quincy, who was an amateur archaeologist and did quite a bit of digging on the mounds along the bluffs of Quincy and Adams County. And I have vivid memories being a child and walking into that dentist's office, and he had lawyers' bookcases, the glass-fronted lawyers' bookcases with rows of skulls in them. So you can imagine a 7-year-old kid going to the dentist, walking past all these skulls. I also had friends who lived on one of the farms down by Marblehead who had mounds on their farm. They protected the mounds. I don't think Dr. Reed ever got to their mounds, but the groundhogs pulled up bones.
Oh, okay.
And Mary's mom wouldn't let her keep the bones, so she put them in a paper bag and brought them to me. I took them home, put them in the bottom drawer of my dresser.
So you're just a young girl.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which worked really pretty well. I was pretty pleased with myself until my mom found them. She was putting away something, and then the bones had to go back to the mound, which is where they should have been in the first place. I suspect those were human bones, but I was too young to really know. So I was interested in archaeology. I started reading, and I read things that I have no idea what brought me to them. I read things like Breasted's History of Egypt. Nobody reads that thing front to back, but I did. I got absolutely fascinated with Rudinko's Frozen Tombs of Siberia. It was about the Altai Mountains and the horse nomads, and the tombs were tumuli that had big stone cairns on top of them. And there was, just by happenstance in weather, the tombs were soluble. The soil moisture got into the tombs, and then during the cold weather, it froze and made a little dome over the burials. And summer didn't make, the ice remained no matter the weather. And in the 60s, Rudinko excavated some of those tombs, and I read his notebooks from front to back. He would have to take blowtorches and melt a little layer and then let it cool off and then excavate it. And then he would melt another layer down. And they found felt, and they found clothing, and they found saddles, and they found horses. And I was fascinated. But that's a long way from being an actual archaeologist. So I became a librarian.
And then what takes the step from a librarian to continue on and get your doctorate in archaeology?
Well, I married my husband, who was at Quincy College. He was from Chicago. And his first job, and actually his whole career, was spent at the University of Nebraska. And when I got to the University of Nebraska, I was in the municipal library as a reference librarian and found that I had time on my hands. And so I started taking anthropology courses. Don't know, actually, I'm not even sure why. And I was just drawn to archaeology. And I got a job with the Archaeological Research Center there and started doing field work. And one of the men who was working at the Archaeological Center was a specialist in zooarchaeology. And he gave me a lab job sorting bones. And I found it really interesting, and it's sort of blended with my...
Sorting them between human bones or within different animal bones?
Oh, no. He loved to give people challenges, so he set out maybe 8 boxes, each of which had the complete skeleton disarticulated of a particular animal. It would be a turtle over here and a bird here and a raccoon here. And then you dump out a bag of bones, and he said, now sort them by animal. Well, a skull is pretty easy, and a mandible works pretty well. And sometimes, like a talon, you're pretty close. But other bones, I was just at sea. But I persevered. And I remember that when I was done with my first semester, and he said, so do you think you want to be a zooarchaeologist? And I just looked at him and I said, I don't know. And he just walked away. So it was a while before I actually decided that was what I wanted to do. But it's a way to bring natural history and environmental studies and human behavior all get wrapped up in our relationship with animals and what we do with those animals.
So what actually took you to Greece?
Oh, that's a great story. I went from Nebraska to graduate school in anthropology at the University of Tennessee because there was a connection there. The professors knew each other, and I was working on my dissertation, and the chairman of the department was Bill Bass. And I don't know if you know the name, but Bill Bass was famous for organizing the bone farm. He was a forensic anthropologist, and this is at the time that forensics in criminology and in identification were just really growing. And I shared a lab, a processing lab, because I got one thing about American archaeology: when you're a student, you can make money. You can pay your way, and I did, by being the preparator for skeletons. So I'm down in the lab, and I'm flensing down and boiling up bodies of animals. And right next to me is a forensic anthropologist who's doing the same thing, but they're not animals that they're working on. So I won't tell any of those stories. But there was a physical anthropologist whom I knew, we shared some classes, named Mortality Listen, and she also had a degree in classics. And she came down the hall one day, and I remember that she stopped at a couple of office doors, and she was asking people, is there anybody who wants to spend a couple of weeks in the Aegean? And all of my serious PhD candidate friends said, oh, no, we're working on our dissertations. And I just thought for a while, and I thought, I don't know, I'll go talk to them. It was very, very interesting. Classics department, classical archaeology, completely different than North American archaeology. They didn't really... American archaeology was going through that new archaeology phase of ethnoarchaeology and taphonomy, the study of death assemblages. Classical archaeology was still in the culture history phase, where it was informed so much by the written record and the inscriptions that they would pick up bones in an excavation, say, oh yeah, we got sheep and goat and pig and cow, and then the bones would go back in the ground. So I bargained with them, and I said, I will come and do your animal bones for you. You have to pay my way, of course, which doesn't happen usually in classical archaeology. And you have to promise me that you will screen what you're doing. Because if you're only picking up the big bones that you can see, you're going to miss all the small animals. And that was another thing that North American archaeology was really beginning to exploit, was careful screening, careful quantification, scientific archaeology, really. And they agreed. I think that first summer I was there for maybe 4 weeks. But after that, I went back for 18 summers, I think, to Crete, to a project, the Kavousi project. And
then were you in Athens too, right?
Well, I went through Athens each year because when foreign excavations in Greece and in many of the Mediterranean countries are limited. You can have 3 excavations. The permits, 3 American excavations. The permits run for maybe 10 years. So the basis for this excavation was at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. So every year I would fly over 26 hours all the way to Crete, but I would stop in Athens on the way. Athens has the Agora excavation, also sponsored by American School, and they had bones. They are just like every other excavation. They were digging in refuse pits and wells, and so it just seemed natural that and my friend Mortality Listen was working in the Agora on human burials, so I just sort of tagged along, and pretty soon somebody would come up and say, hey, we just got some bones the other day. Would you take a look at them? That's how many a zooarchaeologist has gotten started. And that's how I got started in classical archaeology.
So Greece, just its geographic situation, being mountainous, 2,000 islands or something like that, does that affect their tradition and culture and what you encounter? The fact that their geographic, the nature of just Greece in general? Well,
it did in that Kavousi project, which was on the island of Crete. The Cretans were seagoing people.
Right.
And we...
and heavily influenced Greek culture, too.
Right. And vice versa. Also, I was fascinated by the fact that the Cretans were considered kind of outlaws. if you had Cretan relatives, the people who lived in Athens, many of them had relatives from the island of
Now,
Greece.
Lynn, we both have relatives to say.
Yes, it's familiar in all cultures.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think that I started out in my Minoan period, which was
Sure, yeah.
definitely a seagoing culture. But even in working with the mainland cultures, there's a real tradition of the city-states.
Right.
So rather than we don't think in the early history of Greece of a nation, we think of nation states. So Athens and Sparta, and they were fighting, and they had their own navies, their ships. I guess you don't call it a navy. They had their own armies. They had their own philosophies, and
it's almost like the geography, especially in that time period. How difficult is it to travel around Greece now because of the geography? I mean, is modern innovations and travel easy now? Because it seemed like it would be very difficult back then to get from, say, where Sparta was to Athens.
Well, now, by the time I was there, I mean, yes,
There's
I am a
highways
boomer,
now.
but the bus system was wonderful. The rail system was very sparse, but the bus systems all over Greece, on the mainland and on the islands, the buses run, that's the main transportation. People have private cars, but not so many, particularly if you're living in Athens. Where in the world are you going to put a car in Athens?
Right.
A lot. So
how about all these islands, especially, say, Crete, for example? How do they get connected to the mainland?
By the ferries.
Oh, okay.
The ferries are wonderful because the ferries are working ferries. If you take the ferry, I would go down to Piraeus, which is the harbor below Athens, and I would get on the ferry. We would get on the ferry, and we'd watch the trucks come onto the ferry because Crete is one of the garden spots of the Mediterranean. So fruit and vegetables and grapes and obviously olive oil. They would be taking products down for the canned goods and soft goods, and they would be bringing back, when we came back and got off the ferry, the semi-trailers would come off with loads of goats and sheep, and it was a really working, and that I think was the secret of their success. They couldn't make their money by tourist trade, but by day passengers and by produce and fruit and livestock. So they worked between all the islands. There was an airline, Olympus Airlines, which went belly up and was state owned. They flew into Crete, but they flew into Heraklion. And that's coming off, I know you've done a lot of world travel, that's coming off the ocean, and you come down like this to land. And there were times when we wouldn't make it the first time or the second time. And, I guess we finally got used to that pull up and turn and go around.
I've had a few situations. Those are never fun.
No.
So, the interesting thing is, I'm a historian, but in the study of Troy, it was always thought that was just a story. But it was actually archaeology that proved that Troy existed. Now, it couldn't prove the specifics about the story and if Helen launched 1,000 ships or her beauty. But it was actually archaeology that proved that Troy actually existed. So melding those two together, history and archaeology, is very important.
And that's the strength of classical archaeology, is they do have those historic records. And it's a very interesting checks and balances, because the archaeology often will show you the sort of myths that have developed through the patchy or mistranslated or biased historical record. And the historical record often will give you a key to something that you found in the archaeological record. It's the same in Crete with Heraklion and the Palace of the Minotaur.
So you used it as well.
Yeah.
You used history as you could
Right.
to help interpret what you were encountering during your archaeological digs.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one, and I should say that American archaeology had that stage too. You know, when I was working with the dog bones from the plains villages, the excavation records would say, they specifically said, dig the pit out, count the bones, keep the skulls, put the rest back in the pit when you refill the pit. So it wasn't just classical archaeology. It was, we had people like Louis Benford who really pushed for this scientific archaeology. And so classical archaeology, starting in the 1960s, really, maybe mostly from England, really started to adopt the same sort of practices. Scientific archaeology now is
preeminent.
Yeah.
In Greek culture, as you mentioned, they formed into these city-states, and the polis was the city, and the polis encompassed not only the seat of power and so forth, but the surrounding areas and whatever, if they had any sort of farms or livestock, it would be that was all part of the polis. And the Acropolis was generally on a hilltop, and that was the fortified hilltop of the seat of power. But really what we're going to focus on today is the Agora. Can you explain what the Agora was, since we're going to start talking about a really interesting find within the Agora?
It was the sort of the municipal heart of the city. There was a lot of religious significance to the Acropolis. The Agora had its share of temples, but it also had business. It also had merchants, and it also had in the surrounding area quite an extensive residential areas. It's interesting, the people who are involved in the deposit that we're going to talk about were both citizens and not as non-citizens, métis, they called them. They were basically immigrants, and it wasn't easy to become a citizen, as I understand it. And then there were slaves too. So it was a very mixed hubbub of commerce and government and
just general activity.
Right.
Of the city,
right?
A bustling part of of Athens at the time.
Yes,
and this takes us to where you actually worked. And this is when I read about this, I looked into your book. I think I sent you a message. I'm like, this is pretty amazing. So there's a well in the Agora in Athens, and what's found in the well?
Well, it was excavated in 1938, 1939, and the excavator, Miss Thompson, noted at about 13 meters down in the well. Now, I just have to set the scene a little bit.
Okay.
To excavate these wells in Athens.
I was going to ask you, but because it seems quite the challenge.
Yes.
To have an archaeological dig in Athens.
Yes.
Especially in what used to be a bustling part, which now has to be urban.
Well, and the American School has been digging in the Agora, doing excavations in the Agora since 1931, I believe. They still are today. And the modern city was built on top of the,
Right.
It's like going down Manhattan, and they've done this a few times.
Sure they have, yeah.
But the American School, in order to be able to dig the ancient city, had to buy the property.
Oh.
And so they would buy 4 blocks here, and with great storm and drang, because nobody wants to move out of their houses, of course.
Right.
And then immediately turn it over to the government, because that's part of the plan
Okay.
of the contracts that you sign is you purchase the land so that you can excavate, and then the next day which is only reasonable, you turn the deed over to the government, then you have the 10 years to do the excavation. And that's just slowly by increments gone to the extent that you see today when you visit modern Athens. But this area that we were excavating in, I shouldn't say we, that Miss Thompson excavated in, the wells were dug into bedrock, and usually about, I'd say a max of 2 meters across at the top. They were often stone-lined, and they might have stone steps built into the side, but, the steps would be 18 to 22 inches apart and only stick out 4 inches from the wall, so that workmen could get down into the well in ancient times to clean the well out. This particular well was, 1.5 meters in diameter and through the bedrock, and they started excavating at surface level, of course, found huge rubble fill. The wells were often stopped with rubble when they went out of use. And then at 13 meters down, and the only way to get in there, they put a winch on the top that sort of looks like, if you imagine the old winches that they used in an oil field, when they were digging out. And the workmen would literally be lowered down on a rope, and they'd get down to the level where they were digging, and then the buckets would be lowered down. They fill them up, and they pull them out. At 13 meters down in this particular well, they hit the modern water level. So from everything from 13 meters to 21 meters, I think, is maybe they went down to, about 23 meters was below the water level. So now they're dealing with dark and narrow and muddy and water. I just really admire them. The laws of Greece said that the workmen who actually worked in doing the excavation had to be Greek. So Miss Thompson probably was never down there, which I can understand. She had 2 twins who were 3, and she had a 3-month-old baby that she was also taking care of. So, probably the last thing she wanted to do was go down in a 20-meter hole in the ground. But that's, and there are pictures.
My wife was watching the grandkids today. She might have said, Mrs. Thompson, I think I would go down in that one.
That's true. There were probably days.
What did they find down there?
Well, Miss Thompson notes in her diary that about 13 meters down, below the water level a bit, they begin to find bone. And she notes that there are dog skulls. And then that continues for 13 meters to 18 meters, the 5 meters of this deposit, heavily concentrated bone. They were all very green because this had been an area of a bronze workshop.
Okay, yeah.
So the bronze debris, and in fact, the well was part of the water supply for this bronze workshop and house.
Back in that time period.
And right, about the second quarter of the 2nd century BC, which that's like 175 to 150 BC.
Okay.
And a man named Larry Angel, who was a paleontologist, I think he started out, came to look at the bones, and he said to her, well, some of these are human. And she sort of ignored that and went on, and her field notebooks only talk about she's finding more and more bone. Then they get down through a layer of bone and pottery and bronze, and they finally reach a sterile level. They never quite reached the bottom of the well, but they came into sterile soil, so they presumed, and I think they were right, that they were below the use level of the well. So that's the easy story. The more complicated story is that Angel came back and looked at the collection after it had been excavated, and Miss Thompson did this in like 2 weeks at the end of a season. Got through this deposit. It was put away, cleaned and put away. And when Larry Angel came back to look at it, he found that the bones were almost exclusively those of infants. And he estimated, I think, that there were 120, I think, something like that, infants represented in this well, human infants.
So you almost, at this point, you referenced forensics,
Mm-hmm.
but when I read that, I'm like, we have a mass grave.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you're almost a crime scene investigator.
Right.
But, however, hundreds and centuries in the past.
Right. And this is something that we zooarchaeologists would call taphonomy. What is the death? What's the history of these bones from the time they reached the ground to the time they were recovered? So, and I had, as I said, I'd been working with forensic types at the University of Tennessee. Mariah Liston came onto this project to do the human bones, and that we were working in the Agora. I would stop during the summer. Mariah was also working on the Kavusi project, so we often were there at the same time. And then a third woman, Susan Rotroff, who's a pottery specialist and who had begun working in the Agora and actually had talked to the woman who dug the excavation about the possibility of looking at the pottery from the excavation. We, through a kind of a complicated process, I talked to the man, T. Leslie Scher, who was the director. And I said, I hear that there are dogs in this deposit. I'd really like to look at the dogs. I worked with dogs from Plains Indian sites. I have experience, and I'd really like to see what was it why were these dogs in this well? And I knew that the babies had been there too.
So you're piecing all this together. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure she didn't anticipate what she was going to find, but she found a mass grave. And not only was there a mass grave, there were dogs in the grave
Yes.
as well. And then, of course, there were pieces of pottery and other things, metals and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Did they use it almost as a refuse, just throwing things down the well once the well was no longer active?
Well, that's the question that we set out to answer. First of all, Mariah and I are down in the basement of the Stoa of Atlas, which is the work area for the American School at the Agora. And we're pulling out these wooden drawers, and they are filled with bones, and they're all bright green, almost the color of your curtain back there. Just masses of them. And someone at some time had tried to separate the human infant bones from the animal bones. But what we found was that it wasn't a complete. They hadn't completed the job.
Back to your
Yes.
professor sitting
Yes.
you down.
Yes, exactly.
And giving you a box.
But I was a little better off because
You were better. Yeah.
I knew dog bones by that time. So Mariah and I went through this box after box after box of bones. One of the complicating factors.
What are you thinking? Are you thinking at first like this is horrifying, or what goes through your mind to go through these those boxes of bones and see what you see?
Well, since I
does it send a chill a little bit?
Well, I had learned earlier when I was at Tennessee and I was working with the forensic anthropologists. I admire so much what they do. So many of them work with a missing and exploited children network, and the job that they do is a hard job and a really it's like being an EMT. I realized that I wanted to work with animal bone. I really didn't. I did a couple of joint projects at Tennessee with the forensic anthropologists looking at breakage of bones or animal tooth marks on bones. And when I would read the side of the box and find out where these bodies had come from or the story that was behind them, it wasn't something that I could take home with me easily at night. So I decided I wanted to be a zooarchaeologist. But I admire so much the work that the forensic anthropologists do. So Mariah and I both had a background. So for us, it was the scientific question. Obviously, we wanted to be able to give people answers as to why all of those infants the bodies of all those infants ended up in that one well.
That's right.
And it was unique for the Agora, and it had kind of been put away, and no one had looked at it since the 1930s.
So just to put it into context, in Greek history, if you go back to about 470 BCE, that's the defeat of the Persians, the famous 300 with the Spartans, and then the Athenians at Marathon. And then the Greeks from that point have a golden age for the most part. Mm-hmm. But we're talking 400 BCE. By the time of the Agora Bone Well, and when it was in use, the Greeks had already had basically their heyday. They'd already been taken over by the Macedonians for the most part, even though the Macedonians considered themselves basically part of Greek culture. There was also the Romans, but the Romans were after that.
Right.
So you find yourself in this interesting period in Greek history where their golden age was something of the past. They hadn't been taken over by the Romans yet. And I know in the book, your book, it's mentioned that there was the siege of Sulla, and Sulla was a Roman general who laid siege to
86
BCE.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that was after that. So,
right.
So you're thinking, okay, well, maybe this is part of the siege, and then you realize, well, it's not a part of the siege either.
Right.
So there's no simple answers.
No, and by the time we were working on it, these things there were several theories that had been posed by classical scholars as to why this deposit existed. I can say that from our analysis, the publications that were out there said 120 infants and many dogs. Mariah found that there were 459 burials in the well. 4 were older, and the rest were all prenatal or perinatal or immediately postnatal. So newborn infants, basically, or stillborn infants. And I found that there were more than 150 dogs represented in the well. So it truly was an extraordinary deposit. It was whatever the event was. It was something that we basically were starting from the beginning. We knew from dating of pottery, because the pottery sequences are well known in the Agora now. They've studied them for so many years, and they've been able to tie them even to known potters, famous potters. Wow. And to the historic record, the inscriptions. So the pottery styles, they know when they changed, and we've done the same thing with North American, Native American pottery. So we could date that well, very well by the stratigraphy. And we knew that the date from the well was probably no more than about 15 years, that deposit.
Wow.
About 165 to 150.
I mean, it's amazing to me that you're looking back that many centuries, and now you've narrowed it down to literally 15 years.
Right.
That's pretty good.
And to answer, well, I didn't do it.
I'll give you some credit.
That was Susan Rochoff and her knowledge of Athenian pottery. But I've lost my train of thought.
Well, that's okay, because I wanted to ask you about the very first moments in that society back then, in their culture, the very first moments after death. So the first days of life are perilous.
Right.
You have birth accidents, infections, straight neglect. There's probably even cases of infanticide. And you got to figure this out, because you know that from the record.
Right.
And I might be wrong about this, but I always understood the Greeks. There was a couple of things about the Greeks that I I knew. One is they valued physical strength. Exercise was incredibly important to them. And of course, then it manifests itself in the Olympics and things like that. But really what it was about is physical strength, and physical strength equated to a strong society. Conversely, if you were weak, you weaken society. Now, I don't want to make there's not enough, I certainly don't have enough information to make any judgments about the Agora Bone Well because of that. But I know that about the Greeks. And I also know, and maybe you can correct me here, but is it the first 14 days of birth or the first week of birth that you don't even have a name yet in Greek society? And at that point, it's almost like you're not a part of their society yet as an infant until you get your name. So when I hear about the Agora Bone Well, it almost seems as if a baby died maybe 2 days old prior to the naming ceremony and just thrown down the well as refuse. And I might be wrong, or there's a birth defect, because I was going to ask you about that as well. Did you encounter in the bone record or in the archaeological dig that there were defects that would indicate that the baby was basically killed because of a defect?
Well, now you're asking me for Mariah's analysis. I'm sure you're going to get to the dogs sooner or later.
I am. But I just
yes,
find that part fascinating, how, the way they function just in general. And you can't read into it specifically because we're talking a very specific, he said 15 years. So It's very difficult to do. There's
a couple of things that inform the way we do analysis, and it kind of is analogous to all of the research on early man. There were all sorts of schemes of evolution that were based on the skeletons of early Homo erectus or Homo habilis or Cro-Magnon, but they were based on such scarce evidence. One skeleton could rewrite what they thought the trajectory of human evolution was. It's to a certain extent, it's the same way in the classical period, because you get one man. For example, there's one really famous letter that a soldier writes to his wife, and he says, our baby will be born soon. If it is a boy, may he prosper. If it's a girl, put her out, which was that's interpreted to mean expose her. It was not infanticide, because you were putting the child in an isolated place, and perhaps another family who wanted a child would find that child. Now, that letter is quoted time after time to be evidence of infanticide, but we don't know really. The inscriptions and the written record are so rare that we kind of the theories are based on. That's one of the reasons that the excavation of the well was so important to us, because we had the chance to look at a very large deposit here. We knew the time period. And with careful analysis of the infant bones and the dogs, we could maybe proof the perceived traditions of infanticide or Sulla's
epidemic or something like that.
Yeah, or Sulla's attack.
Siege, right.
And so that's that. I think that's what kept us from just the sheer awe of the type of. Of course, we were thinking about the human stories that went with it. It was at least 459 human stories that went with what was in this well, and if you multiply that by parents and family, it was a huge event. of many repeated episodes.
And I think in the research doesn't definitively say like they were all female or anything like that, so you can't read anything into that, correct?
No, that's also been a question that's been investigated. There are other deposits of a similar nature, or there are in some cases infant cemeteries. With infant bones, DNA is very hard to, as you can imagine, the very porous and poorly, not yet fully developed bone structure, and then you put them in a well with water and bronze, and you're almost surely not going to get any DNA. The skeletal morphology, the shape of the bones, is just beginning to develop. Mariah did use a scale of the shape of the part of the pelvis, and that actually has shown some, by using modern known collections, they've been able to test that, blind test it, and it does turn out to be pretty accurate. And basically of the complete little, I don't know if it was the ilium or which of the pelvic bones it was, the spread of male to female, and she actually did the lefts and the rights because everything's disarticulated. You got one side and the other side. And in one, the males slightly outnumbered the females, and in the other, the other side of the body, the females slightly outnumbered. But we know from modern analysis that throughout the pregnancy and perinatal and immediately following birth, that male children are less likely to thrive. So there, for instance, there's one deposit that.
So there could just be some natural mortality to that as well.
Right. I was going to say that of the older children, and there are very few of them that survived past birth, there is one that shows evidence of multiple fractures that Mariah identified as battered child. There was one that was hydrocephalic, and that's the first time that's been recognized in an archaeological context. One of the things about this well that is so extraordinary is because of the water, because of the bronze, and the anaerobic environment, these bones were perfectly preserved.
Wow.
They were bright green, but they were perfectly preserved. And the same with the dogs.
I was going to, and I know that's your expertise.
No, and I am just as fascinated with the story of the infants, obviously.
Well, and see, that's where it really gets interesting, because if it were just a place to get rid of basically infants that don't survive that first few days after birth, which was perilous, as we mentioned before. But now to complicate the understanding of it, you have all these dog bones. So what did you uncover when you started looking at the dog bones? Were they just refuse? Were they just stray dogs that were dead on the street, almost like a street crew would pick them up and just, okay, I guess we'll just toss them down the well? Or what did you find?
Well, that's I treated the dog bone assemblage in the same manner. I looked for patterns in age and sex distribution.
And you probably had to look for trauma too.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And so you can estimate stature from length of the long bones. I looked at age. Dogs generally, they have all their teeth by the time they're 17 months old or something like that. And obviously tooth wear is not like human tooth wear. So you can generally just put them into puppies, adolescent, and then adult and aged adult. So I looked at the distribution of ages. I looked at the stature of the dogs. I looked at the trauma to the dogs. There was no evidence on any of the skeletons of the dogs of any recent trauma. perimortem. There were, however, a fair number of broken and re-knit bones, usually in the back leg, the tibia. There were a number of the skulls that had depressed and healed fractures. And when I looked at the age structure of the population, it went from smallest puppies to aged, and the curve was very big in the adult range, adult dogs. Now, if it were deaths, the pariah dogs of the city that died on the street, you would expect to see many more puppies and many more aged dogs. Most of these dogs were right in the prime of their life when they went into the well. There were puppies and there were a few older dogs. The older dogs were some of the larger dogs. And I wondered really if those might have been hunting dogs or herding dogs. But I found that the age population was not a catastrophic population. It was a range. I found that there are a couple of ways to tell male from female. One is some morphology of the skull, which again grades. So it can be, one person may see one thing and one person may see another. The unambiguous way to tell the sex of the dog is by a bone called the bacula. And the bacula is in the male sex member of the male dog.
I guess that makes sense.
And so I looked at the skulls, the more complete skulls, turned them upside down and made an estimation of, was I looking at male or female? And it evidently has to do with the way the male dogs hold their head. I don't need you to get into that. And then I looked because they were going into the well complete, all the different parts were there. I looked for bacula, and I found that the count of male dogs' skulls that were complete enough to do this analysis was about 35 or 36. I found 33 male bacula in the well. And I had to use adult dogs. So for the sex distribution, there was no choice for male or female. It was male or female. It was mostly adult dogs. It was dogs that were not pampered. They weren't, for example, there had been speculation that it might have been dogs from the temples that were in the area. Sometimes there were temple dogs that were patrolling the perimeter.
So how did the Greeks generally use dogs?
Well, do
they use them as working dogs? Are they companions at all?
They were sometimes herding dogs. I don't think there's not much in the early records, the early inscriptions and early records that talk too much about dogs as companions. There are some wonderful grave stelae that show children playing with a dog. And we did have a couple of the dogs in the were a miniature kind of dog. There were outliers in the range of stature, from a couple of little dogs to a couple of big hunting dogs. What made this so intriguing was that there is evidence. And by the way, we'll get back to the ceremony of the naming ceremony, for lack of another word. There is evidence in the literature that dogs were used for purification.
Yeah, and I had read that as well, that death itself was considered very unsanitary, and if you would have a sacrifice, say of a dog, for somehow that would cleanse it. Is that
right?
I got that right?
There are some really intriguing texts. One talks about if a person is ill, if you take a dog and rub it against the person's where the illness lies, the dog can absorb the illness from the person. Now, what happens to the dog afterwards, they don't really say.
Right. Probably not good.
Well, maybe. I don't know.
Right.
But, on the other hand, maybe it has something to do with you got a stomach ache and you put a warm dog on your belly and you begin to feel better. I don't know. It's hard to interpret some of these texts, but
maybe there's a level of companionship at that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And then there's also, as in many cultures, menstruation and pregnancy, women are considered very powerful and potentially very dangerous, and certainly powerful during pregnancy. And at the end of a pregnancy, particularly an unsuccessful one, there could be that feeling that they've become polluted and they have to be purified.
Okay.
So whether these were, we kind of also are guessing that we don't have too much, and I shouldn't say we because this is Mariah's research, but there's not a lot of documentation of how birth was handled. Usually there is, there was some sort of midwife. It may have been the midwife who was taking this child. Certainly we wouldn't think that it would be 459 new mothers, and taking this child to a place where the body would be deposited. To get back to the concept that you were talking about, it's called I have to use my glasses, amphidromia. Was the ritual that happened 5 or 7 or 10 days after birth.
Okay.
And at that point, the family gathered, and they say one translation is they ran the child around the fire. Well, now, of course, this would be someone carrying the child around
Sure.
the fire. Or in some cases, they ran around the child. And it seems to have been, I suppose practically it's by that time, 5, 7, 10 days, you have a better idea of whether that child's going to thrive. And at that point, the child would be accepted into the family and given a name. So obviously a stillborn is never going to get to that stage. And by the time that the amphidromia occurs, even at birth, I'm sure that the family has a feeling for that child. And certainly if you've had this child and been doing your best to feed it and keep it alive and it dies at 7 days, there's got to be feeling there. But one of the aspects of the pottery in the well suggests that these infants' bodies were not simply disposed of. There are feeders. There are open vessels that the children were often bathed in when they were newborn that are then, with the infants who didn't survive, are used to carry them to the well. And there are these dogs that...
So what was your final conclusion with the dogs? Before we get to the overall conclusion and the 3 hypotheses that
I think that there's
discussed amongst your team.
There are other reports and instances where dogs, first of all, are buried with humans, and it's hard to say whether those are companions or whether they were a dog that was used to absorb a disease.
Purification.
But there also are texts about purification based on with the use of dogs. And I had also looked actually at some wells that were from the Persian destruction. And at the top of some of those wells, there are dogs that have gone on into those wells as whole dogs. And I think it was to purify, and I'm thinking it's when the Athenians came back, there was some thought that it might have been poisoning the wells by putting dead dogs in them. I think it was the Athenians coming back and purifying that area Then they cap the well and they go on and dig another well somewhere else. Anyway, there are texts and inscriptions that talk about sacrifice of dogs and for purification. So this is a place where unsuccessful births, the infants are brought, because the infants would not be have been admitted into the family, and most likely were not then going to go to the common graveyards. And it was also the place where the dogs that were sacrificed for purification also.
So you end with, the book ends with 3 hypotheses. One is that the infants, we'll start with the infants first, famine or epidemic, which did happen in Athens on a number of occasions, even during their golden age with Pericles, plague went through there and wiped out a ton of people. So that was one, that maybe it was a famine or epidemic and they were disposing of dead infants. The second one, a little more unsettling, is it was just straight infanticide, which you had to consider. And the third was natural mortality because of the precarious nature of birth and the early days of a child in ancient times for any number of reasons. Infection or simple things that we could probably cure today may bring death to an infant. Those were your 3. And what did the group settle on?
I think we think that there probably was a mixture, but that the very narrow gestational age of these infants, they represent exactly the most. Once you get past the first trimester, for example, and of course, again, I'm talking here with I'm not the real expert, but the particularly for that age, the Hellenistic, it was the largest, the most danger for the infant itself was probably close to birth and at birth. So that very close time period is exactly when you would expect that trauma might occur or an infant would fail to thrive. That plus the total lack, except in the one case of the child who looks like could have been battered child syndrome, the lack of any sort of trauma to any of these bones, in cranial, postcranial.
So that kind of, it not that it kind of doesn't eliminate it completely,
right,
but it's unlikely based on that, because if it were infanticide, just working on a farm, like runts and so forth, that's how you get rid of them. So none of that is in the evidence.
It didn't seem. None of the dogs had any signs of trauma. Now, from working with Native North Americans who also did dog sacrifice, the literature suggests that, and I hate to say this because it's very traumatic, but they were often strangled. And you wouldn't see that in the archaeological record, most likely. But I think and maybe to a certain extent, we just wanted to believe that was true. But I think it was that combined with the interval between birth and acceptance in a culture that had a high incidence of infant mortality. It was almost like a mental insurance policy. You gave yourself the time to make sure that you had a child that would be part of your family. Just seems to say that, and the fact that they came there time and time and time again. And the uniqueness of the deposit is could well be just the fact that 90% of the city of Athens, ancient city of Athens, is still under the modern city of Athens. So there may be more of these wells. The tradition may have changed for some reason. We don't know what happens before or after.
So it requires a little more work in archaeology, and that's going to be difficult.
Well, yes, and it's not going to happen in our lifetimes, I don't think. It gets more and more difficult to expand the Agora excavations by moving farther into the modern city. Probably the most extensive excavation that's been done in Athens in the recent years have been the subway excavations. When they put the subway in for was it the 2016 or the 2018 Olympics? I can't remember, that they managed to get the subway system going. They found very interesting archaeology because, of course, they were going to get the permits to do the archaeology, and to the credit of the Greek government, they did very good archaeology, and they have some really interesting archaeological displays in the subway stations.
Well, and I know the Greeks, it's very important to them.
Oh, absolutely.
And they have a great deal of pride.
Oh, absolutely.
In that. So the last question I have is, for someone that's young and interested in archaeology, do you have any suggestions for them? Starting out, you started as a farm girl and you end up in all over the world.
First you become a teacher, and then you become a librarian, and then you go back to school, and you finally become an archaeologist. It took me a while. I think archaeology and anthropology, are ideas of public history now. I think people truly are beginning to see the value of knowing our past. I think we learned a good deal from looking at this one deposit, and it brought up many more questions. I think all three of us would say that we've, it changed the way we think about many things that hadn't stopped to think about before. So not only being an archaeologist, but sharing the stories is what makes it live for me, which is probably why I'm, in a museum and.
Well, this story is very interesting. I'd like to thank our guest today, Dr. Lynn Snyder, and her amazing investigation into the Agora Bone Well in Athens, Greece. Thank you, Dr. Snyder, for that. The featured beer was Single Wide American IPA from the Boulevard Brewing Company in Kansas City, Missouri. The music was provided by the band Bones Fork, and it's available on iTunes, Spotify, nearly everywhere you download your music. Remember to subscribe to your podcast, wherever you get your podcast. It's everywhere. It's on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Just subscribe, and others. Leave a comment for your chance to win a gift card. And join us again next time when we talk, think and drink on History A Go-Go.